Hi, Circuspreneurs. I'm your host, Shenea Stiletto, and welcome to this solo episode of the Circuspreneur Podcast, where I am highlighting the upcoming Congressional Day of Action with RAINN. For those of you who may know or not know, I have a long relationship with RAINN, which is the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network. And it's an American nonprofit, an anti sexual assault organization, and it is the largest in the United States. And they do amazing work. And each year they have an in-person Congressional Day of Action as well as ongoing virtual Congressional Days of Action. And so I've been grateful to come together with RAINN and to advocate for several policies over the last few years as a survivor of USA Gymnastics. For those of you that are listening in that are unfamiliar with my history in terms of advocacy and the case involving USA Gymnastics and the USOPC, where there was the expulsion, or I think that's the best word, of the acute abuse that was going on within that organization. I call it a corporation, and there were hundreds and thousands of victims, also known as survivors, that came as a result of exposing the egregious crimes against children and against adults within the Olympic and within the USA Gymnastics organization, which extended not just within Olympians, but for a multitude of participants and gymnasts from different disciplines within USA Gymnastics and those that were in varying degrees of representation in gymnastics and across generations, actually. So, just a little bit of background around that. And so that has informed my advocacy for nearly a decade now in terms of working with members of Congress and senators across America for different legislation and different policies that protect children, that give survivors and victims more rights and more access to justice and more access to care. My own journey as a survivor of USA Gymnastics was pretty prolific and just ended uh, a couple of years ago with the settlement process that we went through and the criminal court cases. And so from beginning until end, it was about, I would say, 10 years. And so, yes, that was 10 years of court cases and of legislation and of settlement processes, of hearings, of testifying, and all that jazz. So I have learned a lot and continue to learn a lot in terms of advocating for other survivors to have the rights that I was fortunate to end up having as a survivor myself. And I've worked with lawmakers to create and to amend existing policy, and I've been doing that for all of these years now, which has been very beneficial overall to the plight of victims and children that suffer from abuse of all kinds, all shapes and sizes, and specifically sexual abuse. And in all of the different environments that children are vulnerable to experience abuse. And so April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. That is why RAINN has their Congressional Day of Action in Washington, D.C. in April. And so I'm so grateful and honored to be called upon to work with RAINN, to use my voice, to use my story, and to use my experiences to advocate for current bills And in doing that in person, and I also do it virtually as well on an ongoing basis. And so, for those that aren't familiar, that is what has informed the advocacy that I do for the circus industry in terms of health and safety and for increased labor rights and for circus arts recognition by the National Endowment for the Arts. If you hear any of those things swirling around within the industry, know that they have come from me and through me, and from also other advocates that I have joined forces with along the way. And I am also pushing for the creation of safe art or safe circus, which would be an extension of safe sport, which is the basically the policing of all national governing bodies and increases the rights of those that exist within national governing bodies like USA Taekwondo, USA Swimming, USA Gymnastics, USA Hockey. They're all connected to a Center for Safe Sport. And so I have been advocating and working towards having that policy that will give more rights to the performing arts and to the circus arts specifically in terms of reporting all levels of abuse, which is what Safe Sport handles. And, just another nod out there, you can go get Safe Sport training. You do not have to, be a member. So you essentially become a member to be able to do that training. And that training is very, very, very valuable. And I highly suggest that if you are involved in the arts, that you take that training as a performer, as a coach, as a business owner, as a director, as a producer. It's very, very valuable in terms of handling abuse, understanding what types of abuses you should be looking out for, how to, take care of situations that arise within, your circus festival, for example, or your circus studio or your circus school, where these environments, can be very vulnerable to abuse. Many circus programs are in gymnastics gyms, and so, or in a parkour gym or in a breakdance studio. Many of these spaces overlap with circus at this point. And so I highly recommend, if you're going to be a circus judge, I highly recommend that you take Safe Sport training. And I've been working with Safe Sport for a number of years. Like I said, I've worked and work currently amending policy directly with members of the Senate and different members of Congress that have been introducing amendments to Safe Sport called Safe First Sport, or calling the bills different names, or looking at them from different perspectives and in terms of safety and regulation for youth sports. So I am hoping in the next little while that we can look forward to the introduction of safe art or safe circus. And as I said, I've been leading this effort in terms of how we can get these different policies passed, on what level and in what ways, and seeing to it that we, have an ongoing strategy about how to highlight these policies for the circus arts industry in terms of the Safe Art, Safe Circus, or the Circus Workers Act, or the Circus Arts Rights Act. And so, and then also to the circus arts category recognition with the National Endowment for the Arts. And so this, three or four pronged approach is something that that we are advocating consistently for. And so back to the Congressional Day of Action, I wanted to go over the bills that I would be advocating for and why they are important and who has introduced these bills and the offices that I'm going to be meeting with, and giving you a little bit of insight and background into what these congressional meetings look like. I will also be there for Circus, but that will be on another day. I will be meeting with a senator, and I will be discussing that probably in my post my post Congressional Day of Action solo podcast where I discuss how the day went and or the days went. And I am consistently also inserting circus arts advocacy within my Congressional Day of Action as a survivor of USA Gymnastics because at this point in time they go hand in hand. And so it's usually a great way for me to make a new relationship with a new member of Congress or a new senator and get the circus arts industry in their minds as well so that they're thinking about our industry when they're thinking about these bills and thinking about the level of abuses that also exist in our industry as well, because these bills are multifaceted. These bills are not just a concentration on sports. These are bills that are to prevent abuses of children in all areas of life and to also assist survivors in all areas of life across America on either a federal level or some are maybe amendments to state level bills, but most of them are federal statutes and federal policy so that we can affect a broader audience of the population that is victimized by abuse. And so what is the leading issue that we will be focusing on for RAINN's Congressional Day of Action? It will be tech-enabled abuse. And so you're wondering what is tech-enabled abuse? And that is sexual abuse. It covers a wide range of manipulative and abusive methods of harm, child sexual abuse material, AI-generated non-consensual intimate images, also known as deepfakes, image-based sexual abuse or non-consensual intimate images, or sextortion. Tech-enabled abuse is just as pervasive and harmful as any other form of abuse. And so, starting with the first bill, it's the Take It Down Act, and it's being introduced by Senator Ted Cruz and Representative Maria Salazar. It establishes a new criminal offense for the distribution of non-consensual AI-generated intimate images. It requires online platforms to remove these images within 48 hours of being reported. So it was introduced. It was introduced to the Senate committee, passed by the Senate. It is now awaiting to go to the House committee and then get passed by the House, and then it goes on to be signed by the president, who can also veto it once it gets to his desk. The next act is the SHIELD Act, and that has been introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar and Representative Jefferson Van Drew. And it creates a federal criminal offense for knowingly distributing intimate images without consent. It provides additional provisions to protect children from online sexual exploitation. And at this point in time, it's been introduced. It's not been through any committees now or have been passed. There's also the Defiance Act, and this was introduced by Senator Richard Durbin and Representative AOC or Alexandria or Ocasio-Cortez. And this is also a bill that has been connected to Taylor Swift, for example. The deepfake bill is also connected, I believe, to Taylor Swift because she was victimized, in terms of being turned into a deepfake and having her image manipulated. This happened to AOC, this member of Congress, and so that is why she introduced the bill, because it happened to her and she was, terribly exploited online through this level of digital forgery, they like to call it. So the Defiance Act creates a federal civil remedy for victims who are identifiable in a digital forgery. It also creates a 10-year statute of limitations once the plaintiff learns about the AI-generated non-consensual intimate image, plaintiff being the victim. So essentially, once you learn about it, you have 10 years to go after to basically, file that lawsuit, and seek justice on a civil level. And civil remedy means basically that you can sue someone for monetary damages, right? So you can get that civil judgment against them, and you can get some kind of compensation for the impacts of that. For that crime against you, but it's not necessarily, again, holding them accountable criminally. That's something different where, somebody can go to prison or go to jail for acting out in that way against you. So, for me, it's always a two-pronged approach. That's the most important for victims of any type of abuse. You want to be able to go after someone criminally and go after them civilly. And obviously, sometimes it is either one or the other. But it's so great that these different representatives are introducing these different amendments and these different clauses so that folks, don't get stuck in limbo or having to choose between either one, because sometimes you can't go after someone on a criminal level, and that means they won't go to prison, they won't go to jail, nothing will happen against them, they won't have a charge against them you know um forever. And that's a really disturbing thing if you think about it. But you can go after them civilly, and sometimes folks, this is, for example, not talking about the huge big tech companies. This is talking about individuals, for example, that maybe don't have the monetary compensation to even give anything to you after there's been a judgment against them. So you can get a judgment against them civilly and not see any of that money, which is again cruel, and then you can't even go after them criminally. So not only will they not pay back any of that money from that judgment, but they also won't even be going to jail or going to prison. But obviously, getting any kind of judgment to me is justice. So, getting a civil judgment against someone where, again, over time they have to pay you something. Obviously, that is also the way that it works. But this is also too for those that aren't familiar with that. This is really about too going after these tech companies like Facebook, Snapchat, X, Instagram, Google, all of these really big tech companies that enable this abuse. For example, by not taking it down, like the Take It Down Act, where they allow these materials to just be up there for months, and they make money off of these images. By the way, the child abuse material, the deep fakes, they make a lot of money off of these materials. So it makes them money, so they don't want to take it down. So that's why we need the Defiance Act and the Shield Act and all of those things. And then with some of these cases, you can go after the person that created the AI material. But for example, you can't go after the people that distributed it or that have it in their possession, which is wild. When you think about it, you can only go after one person. So these bills are making it so that you can go after three different entities, and hold them all accountable, which you would think is kind of common sense, but that's how these laws work, and then that's how they get reformed, so that unfortunately, you have to take all these different steps to be able to get that full like level of justice. But that's how it can work, especially when folks are in very powerful positions and they can block these acts and they can block these bills. And again, the tech companies, they don't want to have to comply, with any of these bills. They think that they do not need to be regulated, and that they should be able to regulate on their own terms, right? And so these bills are essentially saying no. Once you're dealing with people's public images, it is their right. To not have their images manipulated in this way, and obviously, many of these are exhibiting, the ones outside of just being AI are actual real victims in real life, that have been victimized. And so the importance of remembering that not all of these images and videos are just AI and generated and fake. Many of them are real, and the companies are making so much money off of them that they will try, if nobody reports them and nobody says that's me, and please take that down, they just act like they have impunity and that they're not responsible to have to take that down, because why? Even if it's abuse, it's making us billions of dollars. And so let's see here. What is the next bill? The next bill is centered around child protection. And 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys are a victim of child sexual abuse. Over the course of 2023, NCMEC saw reports of child sexual exploitation rise more than 12% compared with the previous year. NCMEC has received 36.2 million reports of child sexual exploitation in total. The number of files included in the reports also increased by 19% from the previous year to more than 100 million. I mean, it's absolutely insane. So we will also be advocating for the Protect Our Children Act or bill, and that's been introduced by Senator John Corwin and Representative or Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. It will require the U.S. Department of Justice to provide detailed information on efforts to protect children nationwide, provide the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force with the resources, funding, and guidance necessary to identify and locate children. So important. With a lot of those images, those child sexual abuse images online, the crazy thing is that even when they're going to take those images down, imagine this. There is no law that says they have to actually go try to find who those children are. So they're like, we took it down. And then those children are just lost forever. And so the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, this is increasing their funding so that they can actually be required. And there's a law that says you not only have to take those images and those videos down, you have to go figure out and find those children and save them and rescue them. Bringing those perpetrators to justice. And I mean, it's just wild to think that that was not something that they had to do previously. But again, these are all the steps that we're getting towards in trying to hold these big tech companies responsible. For kind of hosting this content and then increasing the victimization of children in so many different forms and capacities. The access to justice and resources. Every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted, and every 9 minutes, authorities find evidence that a child in America has been the victim of sexual abuse. More than 2/3 of these crimes are never reported to police, and only 25 out of every 1,000 rapists, 25 out of 1,000 rapists will end up in prison. Victim advocacy programs across the country are facing $600 million in budget cuts, resulting in programs having to cut staff, services, or shut down entirely, which is, an absolute tragedy. The next bill that I will be advocating for on RAINN's Congressional Day of Action is the No Time Limit for Justice Act. It's been introduced by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and it incentivizes states to eliminate their statute of limitations for criminal prosecution and civil suits involving child sexual abuse. I think that there should be no statute of limitations. This continues to be kind of a controversial topic for folks saying, you can accuse somebody like 40 years later of abuse and, how relevant is that? So many people can get caught up and, be lied on and, where is kind of like, where is the line on all of that? And, so again, it just puts so much hands and power, so much power in the hands, excuse me, of the perpetrator, right? Because wouldn't they love a time limit on someone reporting terrible crimes against them? And what we know as survivors and working in survivor spaces is that it can take a minimum of a decade for a victim or a survivor to come forward about their case. I mean, that's what my case was like. And I was at the very limit of the statute of limitations in California to be able to report my abuser. And again, when you've been a part of cases where these perpetrators have been abusing for 20, 30, 40 years, right? Without anyone reporting them in the way that it brought them to justice, right? Not like they weren't reported, but that nothing really stuck. It changes your mind in terms of how long statutes should be. And I think that it should for anyone that really looks at it that way, where these are literally people that are, have been doing this for decades before anyone speaks up or before there's enough of a case to bring against them or for whatever space that they're in that's been corrupted, decides, that there's, again, people that are involved are able to get the proper evidences. They finally get listened to. I mean, that's what happened with us as survivors of USA Gymnastics. These same abusers were around for decades before it, exploded, and they were finally brought to justice. And so, in keeping that in mind, it's a that's why we need to relinquish these statute of limitations, and then also too, in terms of being able to go after these spaces civilly. These big companies and corporations and organizations, they really do benefit as well for the limit of statute of limitations. And of course, they want that because they don't want to have to pay out, hundreds of millions of dollars to the thousands of victims that have had their lives impacted and ruined by these cases. They would, of course, rather not have to compensate anybody monetarily, even though they're the ones that have benefited so much from folks being abused. They have, and from things, staying quiet for so many years. These are, these corporations and organizations are worth hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. So, of course, it serves them to, say, hey, you had your 5 years, you had your 3 years. And again, remember, most of these offenses are happening when people are children. And, it takes a while for you to, to speak up, to find the words, to express what happened to you, sometimes to, remember these terrible things that happened to you that maybe you blocked out as a child, which happens. And so there's so many different influences in these cases that go into why we're advocating, for these bills in these particular ways, right? And in my experience, and not only my own story, but thousands of, survivors that I've, spoken to and organized with and advocated with and things now for these past years, it's like all of those experiences really inform my understanding of why these bills are set up in the way that they are and the key issues that we need to legislate, right? So that folks aren't up against those same difficulties that I was up against, for example. And there is also the Crime Fund Stabilization Act. It's being introduced by Congresswoman Ann Wagner, and it addresses the devastating $600 million cut facing victim assistance programs by redirecting funds collected through the False Claims Act into the Crime Victim Fund through fiscal year 2029 that has just been introduced, and also appropriations. And what are appropriations? We will also be advocating for this. Appropriations are a decision process made by Congress on how to allocate a portion of federal spending. Excuse me. RAINN is submitting a number of requests, but they are prioritizing two for the Congressional Day of Action, and that is the National Sexual Assault Hotline and the Debbie Smith DNA Backlog Grant Program. And both are so incredibly important. And we are going to be advocating for $3.15 million for the National Sexual Assault Hotline. The NSAH provides confidential crisis support to survivors. It also offers a telephone hotline, an online chat, and a Spanish language hotline. The NSAH has served 4.5 million survivors since its creation and currently supports over 27,000 visitors per month. I don't know why I cannot pronounce H today. Oh my God, sometimes it's just the day. Excuse me. And so, this National Sexual Assault Hotline, I will be joined by volunteers for this hotline who are usually survivors themselves. And they have some really powerful stories to tell. They are going to be sharing the stories of children that call this hotline and detail their abuses. And, when you're calling this hotline and it's children's stories, these are not necessarily stories that end up going to court. Many of them, tell many of the hotline workers, please just don't ever forget my story. You're going to be probably the only person that hears my story. And my story may never land in anyone else's ears, and how devastating that is. They don't necessarily have a pathway to justice, and they might not survive that abuse. And also, as adults, it just, again, might just be something within their past that they never share and they never go forward with criminally, which, survivors have every right to do. And many survivors actually choose that pathway, or they don't have the pathway to justice because of our legal system. So they're actually, it occurred in a state with certain laws, and so they don't fit within any law that will grant them that justice. And so I also encourage you, if you are in need of assistance and help, to use that hotline, because it is a very beneficial tool for those being victimized, or if you need to help a friend that has been victimized or is being victimized. And you'll get some really incredible support on that hotline. The Debbie Smith DNA Backlog Grant Program, we're asking for $130 million to be appropriated in funds for that, and it helps addresses the backlog of processing evidence for violent crimes, including sexual assaults. It prevents future backlogs, and it also uploads offender DNA into CODIS, which will solve more crimes, take dangerous offenders off the streets, and bring justice to survivors. So these are just, such important bills that I am so, honored, to support and to advocate for. And some of them are, newer versions and of bills that I've advocated for in the past. And I believe when I went to Congressional Day of Action last year, there were about 5 bills that we got passed by advocating in person and speaking with these offices. And so when I go in and, I share my story, I connect it in certain ways strategically to the bill that we are seeking for that representative um, to um, to support. And on that day, I will be meeting with Representative Wagner, Representative Raskin, Representative Morell, Representative Ross, Representative Burkett, and Representative Boyle. And so, you can advocate on your own. You can contact those offices and tell them that you support these bills and that you want their support for these bills, and that we need to get these bills passed, and connect it to, something in your history, in your life, in a friend, in a survivor story that you know of. You can even connect it to my story, about being a survivor of USA Gymnastics. I know the importance for me in terms of holding these big tech companies responsible is because it is very similar to what I experienced in USA Gymnastics and the USOPC, the Olympic Committee, essentially, in terms of, them kind of being too big to fail and being too big and unique to regulate. And for years, we were silenced and exploited and told that, they were just too big to fail, and that we had so much on the line, and that they represented something so special, and they represented, something important and so prolific to American culture. And we were intimidated out of coming forward and manipulated out of coming forward. And they, again, told, the public, we've created our own laws and our own rules. And essentially, they were just making a lot of money off of the abuse of children. And, again, just a terrible, terrible thing to say and to do and to act out. But these companies and these organizations did this with impunity, meaning that they felt like they were above the law, and they actually existed above the law for so many years. And so that's a very powerful reminder for us when we see these big tech platforms that, essentially say the same thing, like, we feel for you, we're doing all that we can to protect children and to protect these spaces. And they're not. They're not doing that behind the scenes. They are lobbying hard against any type of regulations. They are trying to make deals, with our members of Congress, and, our representatives, and they're lobbying for, bills to get blocked and for different statutes and things to be limited so that they don't have to be held accountable. And experiencing this in the way that I did in a 7-year settlement process where USA Gymnastics, by the way, was on cooperative for that entire time and did so many things behind the scenes to not have to settle, to not have to update their terms and be accountable with new provisions. And they didn't want new laws that were going to affect their business model, which was to have folks toe the line and have, just access to your child and access to their care and to their safety, and to essentially have everyone a part of their organization do whatever they wanted so that their children would be successful in gymnastics. And we know that that is a heinous way to act. And that nothing is worth that sacrificing your child or sacrificing yourself, if you are the child within that scenario, to do well in sports. And so, to bring it all back around, thank you so much for tuning into this solo episode where I discussed RAINN's Congressional Day of Action. I'm your host, Shenea Stiletto. Thank you so much for tuning into this solo, short, special series or episode of the Circuspreneur Podcast. We are sponsored by stagelink.com, and we are available on all podcast platforms. And please like, subscribe, tag the podcast. It really, really, really helps us to continue to present and make this I think high quality content available for the industry and outside of the industry. And yeah, use your voice, everyone, and advocate for these policies. And there is probably at least one person in your life that's been affected adversely by abuse or exploited in some way, shape, or form in any area of your life. But if it's specifically within the competitive gymnastics environment, or the circus arts, or the performing arts, or the entertainment industry, these are issues that affect us in our industries and in our spaces. And we deserve to be protected and have provisions just like anyone else in any other type of industry. And so this is the way to do it. And this advocacy does work. Believe me, being in these spaces, but it does take work, and it does take some level of patience, and it takes a lot of energy. And, I just salute all the brave survivors out there and the policy advisors and everyone that volunteers with RAINN as well. They are, really, they do really brilliant work. And, in advocating for policies. And obviously, this is something that they do all day, every day. These are not easy topics. And, I do it regardless. I know that these are not topics that folks like to listen to or hear about. It's so much easier to just turn a blind eye and to say that this doesn't affect me and never will. And it's too difficult of a topic to discuss or to speak about. And so, I highly encourage you to not let those narratives hold you back from discussing these crimes and these injustices against children and then against adults at different times in their lives. You never know when you will need a certain level of protection or law that's on your side. And I hope that you seek that out for yourself. If you are in a difficult space in your life or you have been exploited in some way, and that you look towards your path to justice, I'll say it really helped me in my journey as a survivor of USA Gymnastics. It's what I think gave me my passion and my sense of purpose. Something that, someone tried and a lot of people tried very hard to take away from me. And so pursuing those paths was really essential and important to me. And so maybe that's also your path to justice and to reclaiming your power. So thank you again. And I look forward to you all tuning in on the next Circuspreneur Podcast episode. I'm your host, Shanice Leto. Thank you. See you next time.